The cameras were rolling. The band was playing. The studio was laughing. Then a stranger spoke, and the most powerful host in America froze. It was a Thursday night in November 1979. The Tonight Show was running like clockwork, just as it had for 17 years. Johnny Carson stood behind his desk, index cards in hand, delivering his monologue with the precision of a surgeon and the timing of a jazz musician. The audience was warm. The jokes were landing. Ed McMahon's laugh echoed from the sidekick chair like it always did. And then, from somewhere in the fourth row, a voice cut through the laughter. "Mr. Carson." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But something in that voice made Johnny stop mid-sentence. His eyes searched the audience, squinting past the stage lights. A woman was standing. Mid-40s. Gray cardigan. Hands trembling at her sides. "Mr. Carson," she said again, her voice cracking. "You saved my life." The band stopped. Not because anyone signaled them, but because even Doc Severinsen knew something extraordinary was happening. The studio fell into a silence so complete you could hear the hum of the stage lights. Johnny Carson stood motionless. His index cards slipped from his fingers and scattered across the stage floor. In 30 years of live television, America had never seen him like this. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened next, we need to go back to the beginning of that evening. Johnny had arrived at NBC Studio 1 in Burbank at 4:30 p.m., same as always. His assistant noticed he seemed tired. There were circles under his eyes. His third marriage was falling apart, though he never spoke about it publicly. The newspapers were filled with gossip, but Johnny Carson didn't address gossip. He addressed America. In his dressing room, a small envelope sat on his makeup table. No return address. Just his name, handwritten in shaky cursive. He'd opened it briefly, scanned the contents, then folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The letter was from a woman named Margaret. She wrote about her husband's death 18 months earlier. About the nights she couldn't sleep. About the bottle of pills she'd held in her hand one October evening, ready to end everything. And about how, that same night, she turned on the television. Just for noise, just for something to fill the silence, and there was Johnny Carson. He was interviewing Dom DeLucy. They were laughing about something silly, a cooking disaster, a burned turkey. And Margaret had found herself smiling. For the first time in months she smiled. She put the pills away. She watched The Tonight Show every night after that. Not because it was funny, though it was, but because Johnny Carson made her feel like she wasn't alone. "You probably get thousands of letters," she wrote. "You'll never read this. But I needed you to know. You saved my life." Johnny had read that letter 6 hours before the show. He'd folded it carefully and carried it with him onto the stage. He didn't know Margaret would be in the audience that night. Backstage, the producers were frozen. No one moved. No one signaled for commercial. In the control room, the director kept the cameras rolling. Because whatever was happening, it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. The woman in the fourth row, Margaret, was crying now. Not sobbing, just silent tears streaming down her face. "I wrote you a letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you ever got it." Johnny didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the scattered index cards at his feet. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. The audience gasped. "I got it," Johnny said quietly. He stepped out from behind the desk. This wasn't protocol. Johnny Carson didn't leave his desk during the monologue. He didn't walk into the audience. He didn't break the invisible wall between performer and spectator. But tonight he did. He walked down the 3 steps from the stage, past the front row, and stopped directly in front of Margaret. The cameras followed him, operators adjusting on instinct. Ed McMahon rose slightly from his chair, uncertain. Doc Severinsen held his trumpet frozen midair. Johnny looked at Margaret. She was shorter than he'd imagined. Her hands were still trembling. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. She nodded, unable to speak. Johnny Carson, the king of late night, the man who'd interviewed presidents and movie stars, the most watched face in American television, sat down in a folding audience chair next to a woman no one had ever heard of. "Tell me about your husband," he said. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Margaret's voice broke as she began to speak. His name was Robert. They'd been married for 23 years. He was a mechanic. He loved baseball and bad coffee and their 2 dogs. He died of a heart attack in their kitchen, and Margaret found him on the floor when she came home from grocery shopping. "I thought I was going to die too," she whispered. "I wanted to." The audience was completely silent. No coughs. No shuffling. Just the soft whir of cameras and the distant hum of studio lights. Johnny listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to lighten the moment with a joke. He just listened. When Margaret finished, Johnny reached over and took her hand. "Robert sounds like a good man," he said. "He was. And you loved him. More than anything." Johnny paused. His eyes glistened under the stage lights. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think Robert would be proud of you. Not because you wrote me a letter, but because you're still here. You're still fighting." Margaret broke down completely. Her shoulders shook. The woman beside her put an arm around her. And then Johnny Carson did something that shocked everyone. He stood up, turned to the audience, and spoke directly to the camera. "I've been doing this show for 17 years, he said. "I've told thousands of jokes. I've interviewed the most famous people in the world. But I want you to know something." He paused. "None of that matters as much as this moment right here." He looked back at Margaret. "We all go through darkness. We all have nights where we don't know if we can keep going. And sometimes the only thing that saves us is knowing we're not alone." The studio was weeping. Stage hands, camera operators, audience members. Even Ed McMahon had tears in his eyes. Johnny reached into his pocket again and pulled out the letter. "I'm going to keep this," he said to Margaret. "Not because it's special to me, but because it reminds me why I do what I do." He turned to the camera one final time. "To everyone watching at home, if you're going through something hard right now, I want you to know, you matter. Your life matters. And if all I can do is make you smile for an hour before bed, then that's enough. That's everything. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." The show didn't continue normally after that. Johnny didn't return to his monologue. Instead, he brought Margaret backstage, introduced her to the crew, and made sure someone from NBC drove her home safely. The next morning, NBC was flooded with calls. Not complaints. Thank yous. Thousands of people called to say they'd been crying. That they'd hugged their loved ones. That Johnny Carson had reminded them what mattered. The letter from Margaret remained in Johnny's desk drawer for the rest of his career. When he retired in 1992, after 30 years behind that desk, he gave a final monologue that millions still remember. But what most people don't know is what he did immediately after the cameras stopped rolling. He walked to his dressing room, opened that drawer, and took out Margaret's letter. He held it in his hands for a long moment. Then he placed it in his briefcase and took it home. Years later, when researchers were cataloging Johnny Carson's personal effects, they found a small wooden box in his study. Inside were 3 items: his Emmy Award, a photograph of his mother, and a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of handling. Margaret's letter. Johnny Carson entertained America for 3 decades. He launched careers. He shaped culture. He made millions laugh every single night. But when asked what he was most proud of, he never mentioned the interviews, or the jokes, or the ratings. He talked about a Thursday night in November 1979. He talked about a woman in a gray cardigan who stood up in the audience and said 5 words that changed everything. You saved my life." And in that moment, Johnny Carson understood something that most performers never grasp. The greatest gift isn't making people laugh. It's making them feel less alone. That letter stayed with him until the day he died. And somewhere in America, Margaret, now in her 80s, still watches reruns of The Tonight Show. She still smiles. Because Johnny Carson saved her life. And in return, she reminded him why his life mattered too. The ripple effect of that November night extended far beyond the studio walls. In the weeks that followed, NBC received over 40,000 letters. Not fan mail in the traditional sense. These were confessions. Testimonies. Stories from people across America who had been sitting alone in their living rooms, watching that moment unfold, and feeling something shift inside them. A veteran in Texas wrote that he'd been struggling with nightmares since Vietnam. He said watching Johnny sit down next to Margaret made him pick up the phone and call his brother for the first time in 8 years. A teenage girl in Ohio wrote that she'd been bullied at school and had stopped eating. She said Johnny's words, "You matter. Your life matters," were the first time an adult had ever said that to her, even through a screen. A widower in Florida wrote that he'd been planning to sell his house and move into a nursing home, convinced he had nothing left to live for. After that episode, he adopted a dog and started volunteering at a local shelter. These letters poured in for months. Johnny read as many as he could. His staff organized them into boxes, and those boxes filled an entire storage room at NBC. But Johnny kept one ritual private. Every year, on the anniversary of that November broadcast, he would write a letter to Margaret. Not through NBC. Not through any official channel. He had her home address, she'd included it in her original letter, and he wrote to her personally. The letters were simple. He'd ask about her health. About her dogs. About whether she was still watching the show. He'd tell her about guests he thought she might enjoy. Sometimes he'd include a joke that hadn't made it to air. Margaret wrote back every time. Their correspondence continued for 13 years, until Johnny's retirement in 1992. On his final night behind the desk, after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience filed out, Johnny walked to his dressing room one last time. His staff had prepared a small farewell gathering, but he asked for a few minutes alone first. He sat in front of his mirror, the same mirror he'd sat before for 3 decades, and opened his drawer. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a simple rubber band. Every letter Margaret had ever sent him. He untied the band, spread the letters across the table, and read them one by one. When his producer knocked on the door 30 minutes later, Johnny's eyes were red. "You okay, John?" the producer asked. Johnny nodded. He gathered the letters carefully, placed them back in the drawer, and stood up. "I'm ready," he said. But he wasn't leaving those letters behind. He took them home that night, along with the original letter Margaret had written in 1979. He placed them in the wooden box that would later be found in his study, alongside his Emmy and his mother's photograph. 3 items. 3 reminders of what mattered most. Johnny Carson passed away on January 23, 2005. He was 79 years old. Margaret learned of his death from the morning news. She was 81 by then, living in a small apartment in Pennsylvania, surrounded by photographs of Robert, her dogs, and a framed picture of Johnny Carson that she'd cut from a magazine decades earlier. She didn't cry when she heard the news. Instead, she walked to her closet and pulled out a shoebox. Inside were Johnny's letters. Every single one. She sat in her armchair, the same armchair where she'd watched The Tonight Show all those years ago, and read them one by one. When she finished, she smiled. Not because she was happy he was gone, but because she understood something profound. Johnny Carson had saved her life in 1979. And in some small way, she had saved his too. They had reminded each other, across the invisible wall of television, across the distance of letters and years, that no one is ever truly alone. That a laugh at midnight can be a lifeline. That 5 words spoken in a crowded studio can echo for decades. That the greatest legacy isn't fame or awards or ratings. It's the lives you touch without ever knowing it. Margaret passed away in 2011, at the age of 87. Her family found Johnny's letters in that shoebox. They donated them to the Paley Center for Media, where they remain today, a quiet testament to a moment that changed two lives forever. And somewhere in the archives of American television, that November 1979 episode still exists. The band stopping mid-song. The audience falling silent. Johnny Carson walking into the crowd. A woman in a gray cardigan, standing with trembling hands. And 5 words that proved television could be more than entertainment. It could be salvation.